Nicholas Francis adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, a subconscious habit born from years of projecting control. The gleaming conference table stretched before him, a symbol of the empire he had built. Around him, muted voices discussed quarterly projections, but their words blended into a background hum, his mind elsewhere. The room was sleek, all chrome and glass, reflecting his meticulously polished image back at him. Yet, even surrounded by success, he often felt the absence of something deeper, an empty echo in the chambers of his life. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Michelle, his ever-efficient secretary, appeared at the door. "Mr. Francis," she said, her voice professional yet gentle, "your annual checkup is scheduled in 30 minutes. Nicholas glanced at the clock, then back at the team, who had fallen silent. "We'll continue this later," he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Gathering his belongings, he rose. The chair's quiet scrape on the marble floor, the only sound in the room. The hospital lobby buzzed with activity, a stark contrast to the quiet, controlled environment of his office. Patients moved through a maze of registration desks and waiting areas, their faces marked by varying shades of worry and resignation. Nicholas checked in at the counter, the sterile smell of antiseptic settling uneasily in his chest. Hospitals always carried a weight he couldn't ignore, a reminder of life's fragility. This was an obligation, nothing more, a checkbox on a long list of self-maintenance tasks. Yet, as he passed nurses bustling from room to room and patients waiting with a pale, resigned faces, Nicholas couldn't suppress the faint twinge of envy that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. These people, for all their fragility, had connections, a hand to hold, a voice to call their name. He had his empire, and it seemed to echo more with each passing year. As he followed a nurse to the examination area, a sudden announcement crackled through the intercom. The urgency in the voice pierced through the usual hospital din. "We have an emergency request. Any individual with the rare Rachnol blood type, please proceed to the blood donation center immediately. This is a critical, life-threatening situation." Nicholas froze mid-step. Rachnol, the blood type doctors always called extraordinary. Less than 50 people worldwide carried it. For him, it was an odd genetic quirk that rarely came up, except in medical trivia. But the voice on the intercom had sounded desperate. "This way, Mr. Francis," the nurse prompted, but Nicholas's feet didn't move. Instead, he turned toward the sign pointing to the donation center. The room was quiet, clinical. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, preparing equipment while keeping their voices low. Nicholas, his expression impassive, rolled up his sleeves, but a faint tension tightened his jaw. The nurse attending to him glanced at the file. "Rachnol," she murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. "You know, there's a child here who desperately needs your blood. It's incredibly rare. You might save his life." Nicholas said nothing at first, only nodding. The needle pierced his skin, a small sting that barely registered. He wasn't the type to dwell on heroics, but her words lingered, echoing in a place he rarely let himself visit. As the nurse adjusted the IV line, she continued, her voice softer now. "He's just a boy. Car accident. The kind of injuries—" She trailed off, her practiced composure slipping for a moment before she composed herself. "It's remarkable that we found a match in time." Nicholas's eyes flicked toward the partition separating the donation area from the adjacent room. A narrow window gave him a glimpse of the boy. He could see the outline of a small figure on the hospital bed, the sterile white sheets a stark contrast to the frail frame beneath them. Though the boy's face was obscured, Nicholas caught sight of golden curls, soft, unruly, unmistakably familiar. He blinked, the image burning into his mind with an intensity he didn't expect. The sensation was odd, like seeing a reflection in a warped mirror. For a fleeting moment, he couldn't reconcile the strange pull in his chest with the logical explanation he sought. The nurse's voice brought him back. "It'll just be a few minutes. You're doing a good thing." He nodded again, mutely this time, his thoughts elsewhere. The boy on the bed had stirred something in him, something he couldn't name. Was it the uncanny resemblance, or the fragility of the scene itself? Nicholas's world rarely intersected with vulnerability. He had built walls high enough to keep it out. Yet, here he was, transfixed by a small, unconscious figure behind the glass. When the donation was done, Nicholas sat for the obligatory rest period, sipping a juice box with an air of detachment. The nurse thanked him again, but her words barely registered. His gaze kept drifting back toward the partition, his thoughts tangled in questions he couldn't yet form. As he walked out into the hospital's bustling corridors, the image of the golden-haired boy lingered. Nicholas tightened his grip on his briefcase, the cool leather grounding him. For all his wealth and power, he couldn't shake the quiet unease now nestled in his chest, as if the encounter had stirred something far more profound than he was ready to confront. The hallway outside the donor room stretched ahead, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. Nicholas Francis stood near the glass panel that separated the makeshift station from the adjacent emergency ward, his eyes fixed on the room beyond. He had intended to leave after the nurse thanked him for his donation, yet his feet refused to move. The sharp scent of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with the soft murmur of medical staff speaking in clipped, urgent tones. Through the thin, smudged pane, he caught another glimpse of the child, the boy the nurse had spoken of. A small figure lay still beneath a tangle of wires and blankets. Golden curls spilled across the pillow, unruly but unmistakable, their color catching the pale glow of the overhead lights. Nicholas's breath hitched, a tightening in his chest he couldn't ignore. He told himself it was absurd, an accident of genetics, a trick of perception. That was all it could be. However, the sight of the boy instilled a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. Those curls, the shape of his jawline, faintly visible beneath the oxygen mask, something in the way his small hands rested, motionless, but oddly familiar. "Excuse me, sir." A nurse's voice pulled him from his trance. She was brisk and polite, her hands full with a clipboard and what looked like a tray of IV supplies. "Can I help you with something?" He hesitated, his usual composure faltering. "That boy," he said finally, the words heavier than he'd expected. He nodded toward the room. "The one in there? What happened to him?" The nurse glanced at the window and back to Nicholas, her expression neutral. "He was in a car accident," she said. "A bad one, struck while crossing the street. They brought him in from St. Anne's orphanage. He's lucky to be alive." Orphanage. The word struck the still water like a pebble, sending ripples outward. Nicholas's gaze flicked back to the boy, his mind grasping at something just out of reach. "No family?" he asked, his voice low. "None that we know of." The nurse's tone softened, as if sensing the weight of his question. "He's 7. Timothy, that's his name. The staff at the orphanage are on their way, but for now, he's alone. Alone." The word hovered between them, weighing as much as the air in the sterile hallway. Nicholas's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching as he tried to wrestle his thoughts back into some semblance of order. It wasn't his business. He didn't know the boy. And yet, the pull was undeniable, like an invisible thread winding tighter with each passing second. The nurse, sensing his discomfort, nodded toward the room. "If you're worried about him, don't be. The doctors are doing everything they can. and your blood donation. It'll make a difference." Nicholas barely heard her as she walked away, her words fading into the background hum of the hospital. He stepped closer to the window, his hand brushing against the cool glass as he leaned in for a clearer look. The boy's face came into Francis' focus now, pale and fragile against the stark white sheets. His golden hair framed features that stirred something deep and unsettling within Nicholas. Nostalgia, perhaps, or a pang of recognition he couldn't place. His own childhood flashed before him in brief, vivid fragments. A school photo his mother had kept on the mantel, his hair unruly and bright under the photographer's light. The same stubborn curl that refused to lie flat, no matter how many times she smoothed it down. He had always hated that photo. Now, it was all he could see. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, stepping back abruptly, as if the distance might break the spell. He turned, his polished shoes echoing on the tiles, as he strode toward the reception desk. His movements were purposeful, but his mind churned with uncertainty. It was foolish, irrational. He had no evidence, no reason to believe there was a connection beyond chance. Yet, as he approached the desk, the words spilled from him before he could stop them. "I need to request a DNA test," he said. His voice, firm yet quiet, carried the unmistakable weight of a man who would not accept no. The receptionist, startled but professional, blinked up at him. "A DNA test?" she repeated, glancing at the clipboard in front of her. "I'm not sure we can." "Make it happen," Nicholas interrupted, his tone Francis than intended. He softened it a moment later, and the edge replaced by something more measured. "Please. It's important." The woman nodded, scribbling down a note. "I'll need to get clearance, but I'll forward the request to the appropriate department." Nicholas nodded, stepping back, his shoulders rigid. As he turned, his eyes drifted once more to the boy behind the glass. "Timothy," the nurse had said, 7 years old, an orphan, alone. He didn't know what he expected to find in the results. Proof, perhaps, of the irrational pull he felt, or a cold dismissal of the thoughts he couldn't seem to silence. Either way, he could. The wrought iron gates of St. Anne's orphanage creaked open under Nicholas's firm push, revealing a modest courtyard lined with cracked cobblestones and a faintly overgrown garden. The building itself loomed ahead, weathered brick and faded white shutters, a structure that might have been grand decades ago but now carried an air of quiet resilience. A child's laughter rang out faintly in the distance, but it did little to lighten the heaviness pressing on Nicholas's chest. Inside, the scent of old wood and faintly antiseptic cleaner greeted him. The front desk, tucked into a small alcove, was manned by a woman who looked up as he entered. Her name tag read Melissa, and her sharp, assessing gaze softened slightly as she noted his tailored suit and guarded expression. "Mr. Francis," she greeted, her tone professional but warm. "I was told you'd be visiting. I'm Melissa, the manager here." Nicholas offered a curt nod, shaking her hand briefly. "Thank you for meeting me. I understand you've been taking care of Timothy." Melissa's brow furrowed slightly as she gestured for him to follow her down a narrow hallway lined with faded photos of smiling children. "Yes, Timothy has been with us since he was a baby. He's a quiet boy, sweet, but, well, life here isn't easy for any of them." The hallway opened into a modest office cluttered with papers and children's drawings. Melissa motioned for Nicholas to sit, but he remained standing, his gaze briefly scanning a crude crayon sketch of a house and a sun that hung crookedly on the wall. "I'd like to know how he came to be here," Nicholas said, his voice carefully measured. "Who brought him, and under what circumstances?" Melissa hesitated, her hands folding over the edge of the desk. "It's not much of a story, I'm afraid. 7 years ago, a man arrived late one evening. He looked well off. Expensive suit, polished demeanor. He handed over a baby, a newborn, only days old, and said the child's mother couldn't take care of him. Nicholas's pulse quickened, though his expression remained composed. Did he leave a name? Any documentation? None, Melissa said with a shake of her head. He signed a form of relinquishment under an alias, Mr. X, untraceable. He left quickly, almost like he couldn't get out fast enough. It was unusual, but not unheard of in our line of work. Her words hung in the air, each one sinking deeper into Nicholas's thoughts. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the small window behind her desk. The orphanage grounds stretched out beyond it, where a group of children played in the fading afternoon light. His mind churned with questions. Why had this man abandoned Timothy here? What role had Timothy's mother played, if any? And most importantly, was it possible that... The buzz of his phone broke the silence. Nicholas's hand moved automatically to retrieve it, his thumb swiping across the screen. It was a message from the hospital. DNA results are ready. Please contact the lab at your earliest convenience. His grip tightened around the device, but his face betrayed nothing. Thank you for your time, Melissa, he said, standing abruptly. If you think of anything else about the circumstances surrounding Timothy's arrival, please let me know. Melissa rose as well, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Of course, and Mr. Francis, I hope whatever you're looking for, you find it. Nicholas nodded and left without another word, his mind now singularly focused on the results awaiting him. The journey back to his penthouse was a flurry of city lights and subdued chaos. When he finally sat at his desk, the folder containing the DNA results lay unopened before him. He stared at it for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on the edges as though touching it might confirm what he already suspected. With a sharp intake of breath, he opened it. The words were clinical and emotionless, yet they had a profound impact. A 99.9% probability of biological paternity. He leaned back, the leather chair creaking beneath him, his gaze unfocused. The room around him faded, replaced by a flood of memories. Bella's laughter, her dark eyes sparkling as they danced under string lights at a long-forgotten gala. The way she had whispered his name, her voice trembling with joy and fear when she told him she loved him. And the way it had all shattered, ripped away by the cold, immovable force that was her father, Patrick Watkins. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion pressing against him like a physical weight. There were an abundance of questions and numerous threads that needed to be unraveled. However, one certainty remained. Timothy was indeed his son, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure they would never meet. As the night stretched on, Nicholas didn't sleep. Instead, he planned. If Timothy was here, alive and within reach, then there was no turning back. He would find out the truth about the orphanage, about the mysterious man who had left his son there, and most of all, about Bella. He owed Timothy more than his blood. He owed him a future. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady hum of machines monitoring Timothy's fragile recovery. Morning light filtered through pale blue curtains, casting soft shadows across the bed where the boy lay. His small chest rose and fell in shallow, rhythmic movements. Nicholas sat in a chair by the window, his hands resting loosely on his lap. It had been 2 days since he learned the truth, but he still hadn't spoken the words aloud. Timothy stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering open. His gaze was groggy and unfocused at first, but as he turned his head, his wide blue eyes locked on Nicholas. The boy's face was pale, but alert. His golden curls tousled against the pillow. "Hi," Timothy murmured, his voice a weak whisper, yet laced with curiosity. Nicholas leaned forward, the chair creaking beneath him. "Hey there," he said softly. He wasn't sure how much Timothy understood, so he kept his tone gentle and unassuming. Timothy blinked at him, his small hand twitching by his side as if he wanted to move, but didn't have the strength. "Are you a doctor?" Nicholas was taken aback by the question and hesitated before responding. "No, I'm not a doctor. I was just here to help." Timothy studied him for a moment longer before his lips curled into a faint smile. "You look like a doctor. You're all serious." A soft chuckle escaped Nicholas, surprising even himself. "I guess I can be, sometimes." Timothy's eyes drifted shut briefly before opening again. "Where's everyone else? Miss Melissa?" "She'll be here soon," Nicholas reassured him. "You've been through a lot, Timothy. Everyone's just making sure you're okay." The boy's small frame seemed to relax slightly at the mention of Melissa. "I don't like the machines," Timothy whispered, his gaze flickering to the tubes running from his arm. "They make noises." Nicholas leaned closer, his voice low. "They're noisy, but they're helping you get better. Consider them as allies who support you until you're prepared to resume your activities." Timothy didn't answer immediately, but a faint nod signaled his acceptance. His eyes, however, betrayed a quiet resilience, a strength Nicholas hadn't expected from someone so young. Over the next several days, Nicholas found himself spending more and more time in the hospital room. Timothy didn't ask too many questions about who he was, which suited Nicholas fine. For now, it was enough to simply be there. He brought books, a mix of colorful picture stories and simple chapter books. Timothy's face lit up when Nicholas opened the first one. "Do you like books?" Nicholas asked, watching as the boy's small hands reached for the cover. Timothy nodded, his excitement breaking through the fatigue. "Miss Melissa reads to us at the orphanage, stories about knights and dragons. I like the brave ones. Well," Nicholas said, taking a seat next to the bed, "I believe I have the perfect solution for you." He opened the book and began to read, his voice steady but animated. Timothy's expression softened as the story unfolded. Occasionally, he would interject with a question or comment, his curiosity bubbling up despite his exhaustion. "Why do the knights always fight dragons?" Timothy asked at one point, his brow furrowing. "Can't they just talk to them instead?" Nicholas paused, taken aback by the question. "I suppose they could," he said after a moment. "Maybe they're just too scared to try." Timothy seemed to consider this, his small face thoughtful. "I wouldn't be scared," he declared softly. Nicholas smiled, his chest tightening at the boy's quiet bravery. As their time together grew, Timothy began to open up in small, unexpected ways. He talked about the other children at St. Anne's, about Melissa, about the games they played in the orphanage's small yard. However, one afternoon, while Nicholas was adjusting Timothy's pillow and placing a cup of water on the bedside table, the boy posed a question that left Nicholas speechless. "Do you know anything about my mum?" Timothy's voice was quiet, almost hesitant, his eyes, so innocent and searching, fixed on Nicholas's face. Nicholas froze, his hand lingering on the edge of the pillow. He turned slowly, his composure carefully masking the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'm not sure," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Why do you ask?" Timothy shrugged, his gaze dropping to the blanket. "Sometimes I think about her. Miss Melissa said she couldn't keep me, but I wonder if she misses me, or if she remembers me." The boy's words struck Nicholas like a physical blow. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently resting on Timothy's small shoulder. "I'm sure she remembers you," Nicholas said quietly. "You're someone who's impossible to forget." Timothy looked up at him then, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Nicholas held his gaze, his heart breaking for the child who had been forced to wonder about something so fundamental. As Timothy drifted back to sleep, Nicholas sat in silence, the weight of his son's question pressing heavily on him. For the first time, he realized just how much Timothy had been forced to endure, and how much more he deserved. Nicholas made a silent promise then and there. He would find the answers Timothy needed, no matter the cost. For the boy who had unknowingly filled a void Nicholas hadn't realized he carried, there could be no greater priority. The drive to St. Anne's orphanage was slower this time, the familiar cracked cobblestones and wrought-iron gates now imbued with a sense of foreboding. Nicholas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind churning with Timothy's question about his mother. It wasn't just the boy's words that haunted him. It was the look in his eyes, a quiet hope that cut straight through Nicholas's resolve. Inside the orphanage, Melissa was waiting for him in her modest office. She offered a polite smile as he entered, but it quickly faded when she saw the tension in his face. "Mr. Francis," she began, motioning for him to take a seat. "Is everything all right with Timothy?" Nicholas nodded, though his expression remained grim. "He's recovering well, but that's not why I'm here." He hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I need to ask you about the night Timothy was brought here. I think he's my son." Melissa's eyes widened, her composure momentarily slipping. "Your son?" she repeated, her voice barely audible above a whisper. Nicholas leaned forward, his voice firm but tinged with urgency. "Yes, I've done a DNA test, it's confirmed. But I need to know more about how he ended up here. Who brought him? What did they say?" Melissa's face softened with recollection. "I've thought about him many times over the years," she admitted, her fingers lacing together. "He seemed conflicted. He wasn't cold, but there was a distance about him, like he was doing something he didn't want to, but felt he had to." Nicholas leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "Did he ever come back? Reach out in any way?" Melissa shook her head slowly. "Not once. It's like he vanished the moment he left Timothy here. I always assumed he had some connection to the child, but, well, we never had proof. Just intuition." Her words settled over Nicholas like a weight, thick and unyielding. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the orphanage's modest garden. "If you think of anything else, anything at all, please let me know," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. Melissa nodded. "Of course. I care about Timothy as much as you do, Mr. Francis. He's special." That evening, Nicholas sat in his penthouse, the city lights sprawling beneath him like a web of restless energy. His phone vibrated against the glass table, pulling his attention to the message lighting up the screen. It was from the investigator he'd hired. "We've uncovered new details. You'll want to see this in person." The meeting was arranged for the following morning at a discreet office downtown. The investigator didn't waste any time when Nicholas arrived. A slim folder lay on the desk between them, its contents waiting to shatter what little composure Nicholas still held. "We traced the orphanage records and corroborated them with hospital archives," the investigator began, flipping open the folder. "Timothy was born at Seattle General. His mother was listed as Bella Watkins." Nicholas's breath caught, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. The name struck him forcefully, echoing through the meticulously crafted barriers of his calmness. The investigator continued, his voice even but cautious. "She gave birth shortly after your relationship ended. There's no indication she was aware of what happened next." "What do you mean?" Nicholas's voice was sharp, almost a demand. The man hesitated before placing a grainy photocopy on the desk, a document with Patrick Watkins's signature at the bottom. According to this, Patrick Watkins had the child removed immediately after birth. He claimed the baby was stillborn and arranged for Timothy to be sent to St. Anne's. Bella was unconscious during the process and likely fed a fabricated story when she woke up. Nicholas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. His chest felt tight, constricted by a fury he hadn't known he possessed. "He lied to her," he said, his voice low but seething. "He stole my son and buried the truth." The investigator nodded grimly. "It appears so. There's no record of Bella contesting the decision, which suggests she believed Timothy was gone." The room seemed to tilt as the weight of the revelations bore down on Nicholas. He turned away, his hands braced against the edge of the desk. Anger burned hot in his veins, but beneath it lay something colder. Grief. Grief for Bella, who had been robbed of her child. Grief for Timothy, who had been cast aside like a burden to be forgotten. And grief for himself, for the years lost to deception and betrayal. That night, sleep eluded Nicholas. He paced the length of his living room, the skyline glittering behind him like shards of broken glass. Every step brought a fresh wave of memories. Bella's laughter, her fiery determination, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of the future they would build together. And then, the aftermath, the silence, the void left in her absence. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as his mind replayed the investigator's words. Patrick Watkins had orchestrated everything, tearing apart the life they could have had. But why? To protect the Watkins name, to punish Bella for defying him. Nicholas didn't know, and at that moment it didn't matter. What mattered was Timothy and Bella. They had been broken by Patrick's choices, but Nicholas would not let that be the end of their story. He had spent his life building empires, bending the world to his will. This time, it wasn't about power or control. It was about justice, about family. As the first light of dawn crept through the city, Nicholas stood resolute, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He would uncover every secret, expose every lie, and he would ensure that Timothy and Bella finally had the futures they deserved. The Watkins mansion loomed before Nicholas like a fortress, its tall, wrought-iron gates a barrier as imposing as the man who resided within. The sprawling estate was meticulously manicured, a testament to the power and prestige of the Watkins family. Nicholas tightened his grip on the steering wheel before stepping out of his car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel driveway. The butler greeted him at the entrance, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Francis, I'm afraid Mr. Watkins is unavailable for visitors today." Nicholas didn't falter. "Let him know I'm here. It's urgent." The butler hesitated before disappearing inside. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, before he returned with the same neutral expression. "Mr. Watkins has declined to meet with you." Nicholas exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He turned and walked back to his car, but not before casting a glance at the towering windows of the mansion. Patrick Watkins was hidden behind his carefully constructed walls, refusing to face the truth. The next day, Nicholas returned. And the day after that. While patience can be a valuable trait, it can also cause discomfort for those around you. So, in Nicholas's case, do you think his actions are right? If so, leave a comment, "noodles." Each time he was met with polite but firm refusals, the butler's tone became, "Francis," his instructions clearer, "Mr. Watkins does not wish to be disturbed." Still, Nicholas persisted. He arrived unannounced, his determination growing with each rejection. He lingered near the gates, his presence a quiet but unmistakable challenge. The butler's patience dwindled by the fifth visit. "Mr. Francis," he began, his voice edged with irritation. "Your insistence is futile. Mr. Watkins will not see you." "Then tell him I'll keep coming back," Nicholas said, his voice calm but resolute. "Every day, until he does." It was on his 7th visit that the gates opened without protest. The butler didn't meet his eyes as he escorted Nicholas inside, past marble floors and gilded chandeliers. The mansion's opulence was suffocating, a stark contrast to the anguish that had festered within its walls for years. Patrick Watkins was waiting in the study, seated in a high-backed leather chair. His silver hair was immaculately combed, his tailored suit pressed to perfection, but his eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed nothing of the man Nicholas had once known. "Francis," Patrick said, his voice smooth but clipped, "you've made quite the nuisance of yourself." Nicholas stood tall, his gaze steady. "I'm here for answers. About Bella. About Timothy." Patrick's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he leaned back in his chair. "There's nothing to discuss." "Don't insult me," Nicholas shot back, his voice rising slightly. "I know everything. I know what you did to Bella, to Timothy. You lied to her. You stole my son." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Patrick's gaze didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. "You don't understand," Patrick said finally, his voice low. "Then explain it to me," Nicholas countered, his tone sharp. "Explain why you thought you had the right to destroy our lives." Patrick stood abruptly, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice firm but faltering. "For Bella, for the family. That child would have ruined everything." Nicholas's anger flared. "You mean your reputation? That's all this has ever been about, hasn't it? Your precious name?" For a moment, Patrick said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he sat back down, his shoulders slumping under an invisible weight. "You think I'm proud of what I've done?" he said, quietly. "You think I haven't paid for it every day since?" Nicholas's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Where's Bella?" Patrick hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of water on the desk. He took a long sip before speaking, his voice barely audible above a whisper. "She's alive." The words hit Nicholas like a physical blow, his breath catching in his throat. "But she's not the Bella you knew," Patrick continued. "After Timothy was born, she couldn't cope. She spiraled into depression. I had her committed to a facility where she could get the help she needed." Nicholas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You didn't help her," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You buried her, just like you buried Timothy." Patrick flinched, the truth of Nicholas's words cutting deeper than he'd expected. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the desk. I thought I was protecting her." "Protecting her?" Nicholas said, his voice rising. "You destroyed her. You destroyed everything." Patrick looked up then, his eyes filled with a rare vulnerability. "And I've been living with that ever since," he said softly. "You may not believe me, but I've regretted it every day." Nicholas stared at him for a long moment, the anger in his chest warring with a deep, aching sorrow. Finally, he took a step back, his voice steady but firm. "Tell me where she is." Patrick hesitated, then nodded. "I'll arrange for you to see her," he said. "But understand this. She's not the same. She may never be." Nicholas didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the room, his mind racing with the weight of Patrick's confession. Bella was alive, and he would do whatever it took to bring her back. The sun filtered through the large glass windows of Nicholas's penthouse, casting soft golden hues across the open living space. For the first time in years, the sleek, modern apartment wasn't silent. The quiet hum of conversation, the faint sound of laughter, and the occasional shuffle of feet brought life to the once sterile space. Timothy sat cross-legged on the plush grey rug, his small frame dwarfed by the spacious room. His curls, still unruly, caught the sunlight as he pored over a book with wide-eyed curiosity. Beside him, Nicholas placed a bowl of fruit on the coffee table, observing the boy with a quiet sense of wonder. "Did you know dragons aren't always bad?" Timothy asked, glancing up. His voice carried the earnestness of a child who had only just discovered something profound. Nicholas chuckled, taking a seat on the floor beside him. "Is that so?" he asked, feigning surprise. "What changed your mind?" Timothy held up the book triumphantly. "This one says they can be guardians, protectors even." Nicholas nodded, leaning in to examine the illustration Timothy pointed at, a mighty dragon perched atop a castle. "Smart dragons, then," he said. "They pick the right people to protect." The boy grinned, his face lighting up with a joy that was becoming more frequent with each passing day. Setting up the penthouse for Timothy had been an adjustment for Nicholas. He'd had to carve out spaces that didn't previously exist, literal and figurative. The sleek guest bedroom, once a seldom-used showpiece, had been transformed into a child's haven. Soft, colorful bedding adorned the minimalist bed frame, and stars glowed faintly across the ceiling, their gentle light casting a comforting spell in the dark. Timothy had stood in awe the first night, staring up at the makeshift constellations. "Do they stay on all night?" he'd asked, his voice hushed. "They do," Nicholas had replied, crouching to Timothy's level. "You can count them if you ever feel like it." "Do you have stars in your room?" Timothy asked. Nicholas was taken aback by the question and gave a faint smile. "No," he admitted, "but maybe I should." Life settled into a rhythm. Morning routines were filled with shared breakfasts, something Nicholas hadn't done since his own childhood. Timothy's appetite grew steadily, though his favorite part of the meal remained the stories Nicholas would tell. "Did you really climb a mountain?" Timothy asked one morning, his fork pausing mid-air. "Not quite a mountain," Nicholas said with a smile. "A very steep hill. But to a 10-year-old, it felt like Everest." "And you didn't fall?" Nicholas shook his head. "I was careful and stubborn." Timothy laughed, a sound that filled the penthouse with warmth. As the days turned into weeks, Timothy's physical recovery became evident. He moved with more ease, the cautious steps giving way to playful bounds. Emotionally, too, he blossomed. The hesitancy that once shadowed his every action began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that mirrored Nicholas's own. One evening, as the city lights sparkled beyond the windows, Timothy found Nicholas at the dining table, sorting through papers. The boy climbed into a chair, resting his chin on his hands. "Are you working?" he asked. Nicholas looked up, setting the papers aside. "Not anymore," he said, gesturing for Timothy to sit closer. The boy hesitated before speaking, his tone thoughtful. "Can I ask you something?" "Always," Nicholas said, leaning forward. Timothy's fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sweater. "Do you think my mum misses me?" The question hung in the air, delicate and piercing. Nicholas's chest tightened, but he forced his expression to remain calm. "I think she does," he said softly. "More than you know." Timothy looked at him, his blue eyes searching. "Then, why hasn't she come to find me?" Nicholas's throat felt dry, but he reached across the table, placing a steady hand over Timothy's. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "grown-ups have things they need to figure out before they can be the best version of themselves. but that doesn't mean they don't care. Timothy nodded slowly, though the weight of the question lingered. Do you think she's okay? I think, Nicholas said, his voice firm with quiet resolve, she's doing her best. And when she's ready, I promise she'll want to see you. Timothy didn't respond immediately, but his small hand tightened around Nicholas's. It was enough. Later that night, as Timothy drifted off to sleep beneath the soft glow of the stars on his ceiling, Nicholas stood in the doorway, watching him. For the first time in years, his penthouse didn't feel cold or empty. He still didn't know what he would find when he saw Bella again. The thought filled him with equal parts hope and fear. But tonight, he allowed himself to focus on the present, the boy who had already given him so much without even realizing it. And for that, he was grateful. The envelope arrived unannounced, left on the desk of Nicholas's penthouse by the concierge. The return address was unfamiliar, but the name scrawled at the bottom of the single folded letter was impossible to ignore. Patrick Watkins. The note was brief, devoid of emotion. The facility where Bella resides is enclosed. She is safe, but I cannot guarantee you will find her as she once was. Proceed as you wish. Nicholas stood at the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. The letter felt heavy in his hands, its implications suffocating. He folded it carefully, slipping it into his pocket. For a moment, he hesitated, his mind spinning with questions and fears. But then he thought of Timothy, the boy's bright smile, his earnest curiosity, and the unspoken longing behind his every question about his mother. There was no choice. The psychiatric facility was tucked away on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by rolling hills and dense trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Its tall grey walls loomed against the pale sky, stark and uninviting. Nicholas stepped out of his car, the gravel crunching underfoot as he surveyed the building. A faint chill ran through him, though the late afternoon sun hung warm and bright above. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, greeted him with a subdued smile. "Mr. Francis," she said softly, "we've been expecting you. This way, please." Nicholas followed her down a narrow hallway, the sterile scent of disinfectant filling the air. The walls were painted a dull, institutional beige, adorned only with faded prints of pastoral landscapes. The sound of muffled voices and occasional footsteps echoed faintly in the distance. The woman stopped outside a plain wooden door, her hand resting on the handle. She turned to Nicholas, her expression gentle, but serious. "She's in here. Please, take your time." Nicholas nodded, his throat tightening as the door creaked open. The room was small, almost sparse. A single bed was tucked into the corner, its white sheets neatly folded. A chair and a small table sat near the window, where Bella Watkins was perched, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond. Her once vibrant dark hair hung limp around her face, streaked with strands of grey that belied her age. Her frame was thin, her posture slouched, as though the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. But it was her eyes that struck Nicholas most. They were vacant, a shadow of the lively spark he had fallen in love with years ago. He hesitated in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. "Bella," he whispered softly, his voice barely audible above a whisper. She didn't respond, didn't move. Nicholas stepped closer, the sound of his polished shoes against the linoleum loud in the quiet room. He stopped a few feet away, his hands clenched at his sides. "It's me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Nicholas." Still, she didn't react. Her hands rested limply in her lap, her gaze unwavering. Nicholas drew in a deep breath, fighting the ache in his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photo, holding it out to her. It was of Timothy, his golden curls framing his face as he smiled shyly at the camera. "This is Timothy." Nicholas said gently, stepping closer. Our son. For a moment, there was nothing. No flicker of recognition, no sign that she had even heard him. But then, slowly, her eyes shifted. They fell on the photo, and her fingers twitched ever so slightly in her lap. Nicholas knelt in front of her, placing the photo on the table beside her. He's beautiful, Bella. He's strong like you. And he misses you. Her lips parted slightly, a faint breath escaping as her gaze lingered on the photo. Her fingers moved again, trembling as they reached for the edge of the table. You did nothing wrong, Nicholas continued, his voice low and steady. Everything that happened, it wasn't your fault. And Timothy, he needs you, Bella. We both do. Her hand brushed against the photo, her fingertips trembling as they contacted the glossy surface. A tear slipped down her cheek, silent but heavy with the weight of years lost. Nicholas stayed silent, giving her space as she slowly traced the edges of the photo. Only the faint rustling of the trees outside broke the stillness of the room. Her voice was barely audible, hoarse from disuse. Timothy. Nicholas's heart ached at the sound of her voice. He placed his hand gently over hers, his touch light but grounding. He's waiting for you, he said softly. Whenever you're ready. Bella's gaze flickered to his, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. For the first time, there was a spark, fragile and fleeting, but undeniably there. As Nicholas left the facility later that evening, he felt a glimmer of hope he hadn't dared to entertain before. Bella wasn't the same woman he had loved all those years ago, but she was still there, buried beneath the weight of pain and loss. And now, for the first time, there was a path forward. It would be slow and uncertain, but he would walk it with her, step by step. For Bella, for Timothy, for the family they could still become. The sun was setting as he drove away, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber, and though the road ahead was long, Nicholas allowed himself to believe that, perhaps, they could find their way back to each other. The waiting room of the facility was unusually quiet. Timothy sat beside Nicholas, his small hands gripping the edges of the chair tightly. His golden curls were freshly combed, and his shirt was tucked neatly into his jeans. A quiet effort to make a good impression on someone he didn't yet remember, but already wanted to love. Nicholas placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. You ready? He asked softly. Timothy nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Will she like me? Nicholas's throat tightened. She already loves you, he said, his voice steady. More than you know. The nurse appeared moments later, beckoning them toward the room where Bella was waiting. Timothy hesitated at the door, his small frame tensing. Nicholas knelt beside him, meeting his eyes. It's okay, he said. Take your time. She's waiting for you, but we'll go in together. Timothy nodded again, his grip loosening slightly, as Nicholas stood and gently pushed the door open. Bella sat by the window, her gaze distant, as though the sunlight filtering through the glass was something she couldn't quite touch. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, the faint traces of recovery beginning to show in her posture. Bella, Nicholas said gently, stepping into the room. His voice carried a warmth that filled the otherwise still space. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate. Her eyes landed on Nicholas, and then shifted to the small figure beside him. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she froze. This is Timothy, Nicholas said, his voice soft. Our son. Timothy stepped forward hesitantly, his small hand gripping Nicholas's for support. Hi, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Bella's eyes glistened, her fingers trembling as they clutched the edge of her chair. Slowly, she rose, each movement cautious and unsteady. Her gaze never left Timothy, as though she were afraid he might disappear if she blinked. "Timothy," she murmured, the name cracking slightly as it passed her lips. The boy took another step forward, his confidence growing as he saw the tears in her eyes. Not sadness, but something deeper, more profound. "Are you my mom?" he asked, his voice small but filled with hope. Bella's hand reached out, trembling as it brushed against Timothy's curls. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm your mum." Timothy moved closer, his arms wrapping around her waist as he buried his face in her stomach. Bella sank to her knees, her arms encircling him tightly as tears streamed down her face. For a moment, the world outside seemed to vanish. The room held only the two of them, mother and son, reunited after years of longing and separation. The days that followed were tentative, each interaction delicate but filled with meaning. Bella's hands, once trembling and hesitant, grew steadier as she held Timothy's. They spent hours together, sometimes in quiet conversation, other times simply sitting side by side. Timothy brought books to read aloud, his voice animated as he shared stories about knights and dragons. Bella listened intently, her lips curving into faint smiles that grew more frequent with each passing day. One afternoon, Timothy took her hand and led her outside to the garden. The sunlight bathed them both in warmth as they walked among the flowers. He picked a daisy and placed it in her hand, his small fingers curling over hers. "This is my favorite place here," he said. "I thought you'd like it too." Bella looked down at the flower, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." Fragments of Bella's past began to surface slowly, like pieces of a puzzle reassembling themselves. She recalled faint memories of Nicholas, his laughter, the way he used to hold her hand during long walks, the quiet promises they had made under the stars. One evening, as Timothy slept in a chair beside her, Bella turned to Nicholas, who sat nearby. "He's so much like you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Nicholas met her gaze, his expression filled with a quiet mix of relief and affection. "He's a lot like you too," he said, "brave, kind and strong." Bella's lips trembled as she nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I never thought I'd have this again," she admitted. "I thought I lost him. Lost you." Nicholas reached out, his hand covering hers. "We're here now," he said, "and we'll figure this out together." As Bella's strength grew, so did her bond with Timothy. He became her anchor, pulling her closer to the life she had thought was lost forever. Each day brought a new layer of healing, a new thread of hope woven into the fabric of their family. And for the first time in years, Bella began to believe in the possibility of happiness again. The Watkins mansion looked different now. The immaculate garden was still perfectly trimmed, the fountains still flowed with precision, but the grandeur felt hollow. Nicholas stood at the base of the stone steps, Timothy's small hand gripping his tightly. Bella was beside them, her gaze lingering on the tall windows that once framed her childhood home. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," Nicholas said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Bella shook her head, her grip tightening around the daisy Timothy had given her earlier. "I need to," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Together, they ascended the steps. The butler opened the door, his expression softer than Nicholas remembered. Without a word, he stepped aside, allowing the family to enter. The air inside the mansion was cold and still, carrying the faint scent of aged wood and polish. Patrick Watkins was seated in the study, his once imposing figure diminished. The sharp lines of his tailored suit hung loose, and his silver hair, always so meticulously combed, was disheveled. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing briefly before softening when they landed on Bella. "Bella," he said, his voice hoarse, as though her name had been locked away for years. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze steady but unreadable. "Patrick," Nicholas said, his tone edged with a restrained anger. "We're here to talk." Patrick's eyes flicked to Timothy, who was peeking out from behind Nicholas's leg. A flicker of recognition passed over his face, his hands trembling slightly as he set down the glass he was holding. "Is that, His voice broke, unable to complete the thought. "Yes," Bella said finally, her voice strong despite the tears that shimmered in her eyes. "This is Timothy, my son, your grandson." The weight of her words hung heavy in the room, silencing even the faint tick of the grandfather clock. Patrick leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, his voice muffled. "I thought I was doing what was best for the family." "You destroyed us," Bella said, her tone cutting but quiet. "You took my son, Patrick. You let me believe he was dead. Do you know what that did to me?" Patrick's shoulders shook, his breath uneven as he looked up. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now glistened with tears. "I've regretted it every day," he whispered. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." Timothy stepped forward then, his small hand still clutching Nicholas's. "You're my grandpa?" he asked, his voice hesitant but curious. Patrick stared at him, his hands trembling as he reached out but stopped halfway, unsure. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "I am." The boy studied him for a moment before letting go of Nicholas's hand and taking a cautious step forward. "Why did you make my mom sad?" he asked, his innocence piercing in its simplicity. Patrick's face crumpled, tears spilling freely now. I thought I was protecting her," he stammered. "I was afraid of what people would say, of how it would reflect on our family. But I see now. None of that mattered. It was my pride that hurt you. All of you." Bella knelt beside Timothy, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She looked at her father, her expression a mixture of anger, sorrow, and something unexpected. Pity. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what you did," she said, her voice steady. "But I can't keep carrying this hate. It's too heavy." Patrick looked up at her, his tears falling faster now. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "But I'm sorry, Bella, for everything, for taking Timothy, for breaking you, for destroying what we could have been." Bella rose, pulling Timothy close as she looked down at her father. "You didn't just break me, Patrick. You broke yourself." She turned then, her steps slow and deliberate as she walked toward the door. Timothy looked back at Patrick once, his small face thoughtful, before following his mother. Nicholas lingered for a moment, his gaze locked with Patrick's. "You'll have to live with this," Nicholas said, his voice low. "But I'll make sure Bella and Timothy don't have to anymore." With that, he turned and followed his family out of the room. Patrick sat alone in the study long after they had gone. The house, once so full of wealth and pride, felt cavernous and empty. He stared at the daisy Bella had left on the table, its delicate petals stark against the dark wood. From the window, he watched as they walked down the steps together. Bella, Nicholas, and Timothy, their silhouettes framed by the golden glow of the setting sun. For the first time in years, Patrick allowed himself to hope that they might find the happiness he had stolen from them. And as they disappeared from view, he let the tears fall, the weight of his regrets pressing heavily on his chest. The house grew darker as night fell, but Patrick didn't move. He remained in the study, clutching the daisy, as though it were the last remnant of the family he had lost. The garden of the estate had been transformed into a picturesque venue. White flowers lined the edges of the path, their petals shimmering in the sunlight. Guests sat in rows of simple yet elegant wooden chairs, their murmurs soft and expectant. At the center of it all stood Timothy, his golden curls catching the light as he adjusted his small suit jacket. "Are you ready, kiddo?" Nicholas asked, kneeling beside him. His own tailored suit was sharp, but his eyes softened as he looked at his son. Timothy nodded eagerly, his bright blue eyes sparkling with excitement. "Are you ready, Dad?" he countered, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Nicholas chuckled, adjusting Timothy's tie. "More ready than I've ever been." The music swelled, and the small crowd turned as Bella appeared at the end of the aisle. Her gown flowed elegantly around her, the fabric catching the breeze in soft waves. Her dark hair, now fuller and healthier, was pinned back with delicate white flowers, and her eyes glistened as they met Nicholas's. She took each step with steady confidence, a stark contrast to the fragile woman Nicholas had found months ago. At her side, Melissa from St. Anne's beamed, guiding her gently down the aisle. Timothy tugged at Nicholas's hand. "She looks like a princess," he whispered loudly, drawing soft chuckles from the guests. "She does," Nicholas agreed, his voice thick with emotion. When Bella reached Nicholas, Melissa gave her a warm squeeze on the arm before stepping back. Nicholas extended his hand, and Bella took it, her fingers firm yet tender in his. The officiant began the ceremony, but Nicholas barely heard the words. His focus was on Bella, the way her eyes shone with hope, the faint smile playing on her lips, the way her presence filled a space that had once felt so empty. As they exchanged vows, Timothy stood between them, holding their hands in his small ones. When it was Bella's turn, she knelt slightly, her eyes level with Timothy's. "Timothy," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're the reason I found my way back. You're my light, my brave boy. I promise to be the mum you deserve, now and always." Timothy threw his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder as the crowd let out a collective "Oh." When Nicholas leaned down, wrapping both of them in his arms, the three stayed that way for a moment, a family reunited, whole once more. The reception was a joyous affair. Timothy ran between the tables, his laughter ringing out as he played tag with some of the children. Bella watched him with a smile, her fingers laced with Nicholas's as they sat at the head table. "Do you think he'll ever stop running?" she teased, her voice light. "Not anytime soon," Nicholas replied, his gaze following Timothy. "And I wouldn't want him to." As the sun set, the garden was illuminated by hundreds of tiny string lights. The guests gathered for the couple's first dance, the music a soft melody that carried through the warm evening air. Nicholas held Bella close, his hand resting gently on her waist. "I didn't think we'd ever have this," he murmured. She tilted her head up to meet his gaze. "Neither did I. But we're here now, and that's all that matters." From a distance, Patrick watched silently, standing just beyond the edge of the garden. His once imposing figure seemed smaller now, his silver hair catching the faint glow of the lights. He saw Timothy run to Bella, tugging at her hand as he pointed to the dessert table. He saw the way Bella laughed, her face alight with a joy he hadn't seen since she was a child. He saw the way Nicholas leaned in, whispering something that made both Bella and Timothy laugh. It had been a long time. Patrick smiled, not the practiced smile of a businessman, but a genuine, bitter-sweet expression. He stood there for a long moment, as if committing the scene to memory, and then, quietly, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the trees. The evening ended with the family seated on a blanket beneath the stars. Timothy lay between Nicholas and Bella, his head resting on Bella's lap as Nicholas pointed out constellations in the sky. "That one looks like a dragon," Timothy said sleepily, his voice muffled by a yawn. "Then it's a guardian dragon," Bella said, stroking his curls, "watching over us." Nicholas wrapped an arm around Bella, his other hand resting gently on Timothy's shoulder. The sky stretched endlessly above them, vast and filled with possibilities. For the first time in years, Nicholas felt at peace. Their journey had been long and painful, but it had brought them here, together, under the stars, with a future that felt bright and boundless. And that, he thought, was the beginning of everything. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.